What if the gods described in the oldest texts on earth were not powerful at all? What if they were exhausted, resentful, and breaking under physical labor they could not escape? What if the divine rebellion recorded on clay tablets beneath the ruins of ancient Nippur was not mythology, but a memory, a workforce pushed past endurance in a landscape of heat and silence and endless excavation? A cuneiform tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum still carries the account of that uprising. Pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago, its message urgent then, now resting in climate-controlled stillness, waiting to be understood. So before this story pulls you under, if you are drawn to histories that refuse to stay buried, subscribe and let the ancient world speak. There is a museum in Philadelphia that most people visit for the mummies. They come through the heavy glass doors of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. They pay their admission. They follow the signs toward Egypt, toward the wrapped bodies and painted sarcophagi and gold amulets that satisfy the particular hunger we have for the ancient dead. And in doing so, they walk directly past a room that holds something far stranger than any mummy, far older in its implications, far more unsettling in what it quietly asks of anyone willing to stop and look. The Babylonian gallery sits off the main corridor on the third floor, a room that rarely draws crowds, a room where the fluorescent lights hum at a frequency just below conscious awareness, and the glass cases hold fragments of worlds that ended so completely we can barely reconstruct their outlines. Pottery shards with faded geometric patterns, cylinder seals no larger than your thumb, carved with scenes of gods and monsters and rituals whose meaning we can only guess at. Clay cones inscribed with the names of kings who ruled cities that are now nothing but mounds of dust in southern Iraq. And in one climate-controlled case, positioned without particular fanfare, without any indication that it might be the most important object in the building, rests a small clay tablet roughly the size of your open hand, its surface covered in neat rows of wedge-shaped impressions, the ancient script we call cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus meaning wedge, lies those strange triangular marks that were pressed into soft wet clay with a cut reed stylus over 4,000 years ago, and then baked hard by the sun or by kiln fire until they became nearly indestructible, capable of surviving millennia in the earth waiting to be found. The museum label beneath this tablet offers a tidy explanation in clean modern typography. It identifies the object as an old Babylonian period text, approximately 1700 BCE, and categorizes it under the heading of creation mythology, a classification that places it safely in the same mental category as Greek myths about Zeus, or Norse stories about Odin, or any of the other colorful narratives that ancient peoples invented to explain the world before science gave them better tools for understanding. The label is accurate as far as it goes. The tablet is indeed old. It is indeed Babylonian. It does indeed contain a narrative about creation. But the label, like most museum labels, tells you what the object is without telling you what the object means, without telling you what happens when you actually read the words pressed into that clay, when you follow the cuneiform line by line and discover what the ancient scribe was actually recording with such care, such precision, such obvious conviction that what he was writing mattered beyond measure. Because if you lean close to the glass, close enough that your breath fogs the surface for a moment, before the climate control system whisks the moisture away. And if you could read those wedge-shaped marks the way the scribe intended them to be read, you would find something that does not fit the comfortable framework of creation mythology at all. You would find something that sounds less like a story told around a fire to explain where people came from, and more like a document, a report, a record of events that someone considered factual and important enough to preserve in the most durable medium available to them. This tablet contains a portion of what scholars call the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest known narratives about the origin of humanity. And it opens not with the majesty of cosmic creation, not with the separation of light from darkness, or the raising of the heavens from the deep, but with a labor dispute. The text describes gods, divine beings, the creators and shapers of reality as the ancient Mesopotamians understood them, performing manual labor, not commanding labor, not observing labor, not blessing labor from on high, performing it with their own hands. The gods described in this text are digging canals through the alluvial clay of southern Mesopotamia. They are hauling baskets of earth on their backs. They are dredging riverbeds and clearing waterways and building the irrigation infrastructure that would eventually make civilization possible in one of the hottest and most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. They are doing this work not for a day or a week or a season, but for 40 years. 40 years of unbroken, grinding physical effort under the Mesopotamian sun, which in summer reaches temperatures that can kill an unprotected person in hours. 40 years of labor so brutal and so relentless that the text says their load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. These are gods. Let that settle for a moment. Beings identified throughout the Mesopotamian textual tradition as the creators of the cosmos, the establishers of cosmic order, the powers who separated heaven from earth and set the stars in their courses and decreed the fates of all living things. In other tablets from this same tradition, they shape mountains with a word. They raise cities from nothing. They command the winds and the waters and the movements of celestial bodies. They are, by every definition we understand when we use the word divine, they are gods. And yet here, in what may be the oldest creation narrative we possess, they are digging ditches. They are hauling dirt. They are sweating and straining and complaining about working conditions with a specificity that sounds less like theological poetry and more like the grievances you might hear from a construction crew at the end of a brutal shift. Gods do not dig canals. That is not what divinity means. Divinity means transcendence of physical limitation. It means the capacity to shape reality through will, through word, through thought. If you must pick up a shovel to move earth from one place to another, if you must carry that earth on your back in a basket, if you must do this day after day for decades until your spirit breaks and you cannot endure another moment of it, then whatever else you might be, you are not transcendent. You are not beyond the physical. You are embedded in it, constrained by it, subject to the same grinding laws of matter and energy and entropy that govern everything else in the material universe. The text does not explain this contradiction. The museum label does not address it. Most academic commentary notes the mythological framework, discusses the literary structure, analyzes the linguistic features of the Old Babylonian dialect, and moves on without lingering on the question that should be the first question anyone asks when they read these words. What kind of gods get tired? What kind of divine beings experience physical exhaustion so total that after 4 decades of labor, they gather in the night and burn their tools in an act of collective defiance? What kind of creators need to dig canals at all when they supposedly have the power to reshape the world with a thought? The answer that the text provides does not fit comfortably into any theological framework we currently possess. It is an answer that has been sitting in this climate-controlled case for decades, waiting for someone to lean close enough to the glass to read it, to truly read it, and to follow its implications wherever they lead, even if that destination is somewhere deeply uncomfortable. Tonight, as the day fades and the noise of the modern world grows distant, as the hum of traffic and the glow of screens begin to loosen their hold, we are going to leave that museum behind and travel somewhere older, somewhere stranger, somewhere the air is thick with heat and the earth is cracked and pale beneath a sun that hangs white and enormous over a flat alluvial plain stretching to the horizon in every direction, a landscape of river clay and silence where something extraordinary is happening, where beings that ancient scribes would later call gods are on their hands and knees in the mud, digging channels through the earth with tools that blister their hands, hauling baskets of wet soil up the banks of canals that stretch for miles across the flatlands of what will one day become southern Iraq. And they are tired, so deeply and fundamentally exhausted that the texts recording their labor-use words we normally reserve for human suffering, for the breaking point where body and will simply cannot continue. That is where we are going tonight, back to those impossible construction sites, back to the canals that should not have required divine hands to dig them, back to the 40 years of grinding physical work that pushed an entire class of celestial beings into open rebellion against their superiors. Close your eyes if you would like. You do not need to follow every word. Some of this will wash over you like water through an ancient channel, and that is exactly right. That is how these stories are meant to be received, not grasped tightly, but allowed to flow, to carry you, to settle into the places where waking thought gives way to something deeper and older and more receptive than the analytical mind. This story exists better in the dark, in the space between consciousness and dream, where the boundary between mythology and memory grows thin, where you can almost feel the heat of that Mesopotamian plain on your skin, almost smell the mineral sharpness of wet clay. You almost hear the sound of copper tools striking earth in a rhythm that has not been heard for thousands of years, but that the tablets still preserve in the cadence of their language. If this kind of exploration resonates with you, these journeys into the forgotten corners where history and mystery converge, a quiet light helps other wanderers find their way to these stories. I am curious tonight where in the world you are listening from, what hour marks your descent into sleep. Leave a gentle comment if you feel moved to. Now let the world outside grow quiet, because tonight we are tracing a thread that runs through the oldest written records on Earth, a thread that connects clay tablets from ancient Nippur to the labors of Greek titans, to the churning of the cosmic ocean in Hindu scripture, to creation stories from the Amazon basin and the islands of Polynesia, and the songlines of Aboriginal Australia. A thread woven from a single deeply unsettling question that every one of these traditions seems to be asking in its own language, why were the gods doing manual labor? And where that thread leads is not only backward into the deep past, but forward into our own present moment, into the laboratories and server farms where we are now building our own workers, our own subordinate intelligence, our own created beings, designed to bear the drudgery we no longer wish to perform. The cycle is turning again, and the ancient canals have something to tell us about where it leads. So settle in. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of water moving through a channel carved into the earth before the first city was built. The canals are waiting. The tablets are waiting. The paradox that has gone unanswered for 4,000 years is patient. And tonight, it will unfold in the dark, layer by layer, like clay peeled back from a buried archive that the earth itself has been keeping safe until someone was ready to listen. The oldest creation story ever found does not begin with light. It does not begin with a word spoken into darkness, or a cosmic egg cracking open, or a divine breath moving over formless waters. It begins with a labor report. The opening line of the text we now call the Atrahasis epic are preserved on clay tablets dating to approximately 1700 BCE during the Old Babylonian period, reads simply and strangely. When the gods, instead of man, did the work, bore the loads. Let that settle for a moment. The very first line of what may be the oldest extended narrative about human origins on Earth is not a statement about cosmic purpose or spiritual destiny or the unfolding of divine will. It is a statement about who was doing the work before we existed. It is a timesheet entry. Now it's before humans, the gods did the labor. After humans, the labor was transferred. Everything that follows in this remarkable text flows from that single bewildering premise. To understand what the Atrahasis is describing, you need to understand the world it presents. A world organized not around worship or spiritual enlightenment, but around a surprisingly bureaucratic hierarchy of divine beings with clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and grievances. At the top of this hierarchy sat the Anunnaki, the great gods, the senior deities, the council that made decisions and issued commands. Think of them as the executive class, the board of directors, the ones who determined policy but did not personally implement it. Among the Anunnaki, three figures dominate the texts with such consistency across centuries of Mesopotamian literature that their roles seem fixed, almost institutional. Anu, sometimes written as An, the Sky Father, the supreme authority, the god of the heavens who in most accounts has withdrawn to the celestial realm, overseeing from above but rarely intervening directly. A chairman emeritus more than an active chief executive. Enlil, the lord of wind and command, the god who runs things on the ground, the operational commander, the one who assigns tasks and enforces discipline, stern, proud, quick to anger, intolerant of noise and disorder. And Enki, sometimes called Ea in Akkadian texts, the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of the deep subterranean ocean called the Abzu, the clever one, the problem solver, the engineer and diplomat and scientist of the divine pantheon, the one who thinks laterally when Enlil thinks vertically, who proposes innovation when Enlil demands obedience. These three, along with other senior deities like the mother goddess Ninhursag and the moon god Nana and the sun god Utu, formed the ruling council, the Anunnaki proper. They deliberated. They decreed. They consumed the offerings that sustained them. They lived, by all accounts, well. But beneath them, below the executive tier, existed another class of divine beings entirely, the Igigi. This name, whose exact etymology scholars still debate, may derive from a root meaning those who watch or those who observe and serve. Whatever the precise linguistic origin, the texts are consistent about one thing. The Igigi were the labor force. They were the workers, the junior gods, the divine proletariat. What were the Igigi doing? The Atrahasis tells us with a specificity that is almost uncomfortable in a mythological text. They were digging the Tigris River. They were digging the Euphrates River. They were excavating the channels that would carry water from these great rivers into the surrounding agricultural land. They were dredging riverbeds to maintain water flow. They were building levees to control flooding. They were constructing the entire hydraulic infrastructure of what would become the most productive agricultural region in the ancient Near East. Not symbolically, not as a metaphor, physically. The texts describe Earth being moved, channels being cut through alluvial soil, waterways being shaped and directed. The language is the language of construction, of civil engineering, of massive earth-moving projects. The Igigi did it with their hands, with baskets, with whatever tools the texts imply, load after load after load, in the flat, brutally hot landscape of southern Mesopotamia, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, where the air itself seems to press down with physical weight, where the soil when dry is hard as concrete, and when wet is a thick, clinging, energy-draining muck that grabs at every step and resists every shovelful. It is not merely hot. It is actively, aggressively, lethally hot, a heat that breaks down the body's ability to regulate itself. That kills the unprepared in hours. And in this heat, in this mud, for this work, the Igigi labored. The text tells us for how long. 40 years. 40 years of digging. 40 years of hauling. 40 years of channeling water through a landscape that resists every effort to shape it, that silts up and floods and erodes and demands constant maintenance, constant renewal of the same exhausting workday after day, without reprieve, without gratitude, without any indication that it will ever stop. And the text tells us what this labor did to them. The gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. Read that again slowly. The gods' load was too great. Not the humans' load, the gods' load. Divine beings, celestial entities, creatures from the heavens, and their load was too great. This is not poetic language about existential burdens or the weight of cosmic responsibility. This is the language of physical exhaustion, of bodies giving out, of spirits crushed by unending repetitive labor, of beings who have reached the absolute limit of what they can endure. It is the language you hear from migrant farm workers and coal miners and factory hands who have been ground down by decades of physical labor without adequate rest or hope of change. Here is where the strangeness becomes almost unbearable. These Igigi are divine beings. In other texts, gods of this class participate in cosmic events, in the shaping of the heavens, in the establishment of celestial order. The Mesopotamian tradition attributes to its gods the separation of heaven and earth, the fixing of stars in their courses. These are beings of cosmic capability, and here they are digging ditches, hauling baskets of mud. The cognitive dissonance is so severe it should stop us in our tracks. Imagine opening the book of Genesis and reading, before humans existed, the Lord God spent 40 years paving highways in the Arizona desert and grew so exhausted he could barely stand. You would not read that as straightforward theology. You would stop and ask what is being described here, because it does not match any concept of divinity you have ever encountered. And yet, this is exactly what the Atrahasis presents as the foundational premise of the entire narrative. Everything that follows, the rebellion, the creation of humanity, the flood, the reshaping of human destiny, all of it rests on this bizarre foundation. Gods were doing manual labor. They found it intolerable. Something had to change. And there is one more detail that deepens the strangeness further. The texts do not say the Igigi labored in the heavens. They specify earthly locations: the Tigris, the Euphrates, the waterways of southern Mesopotamia, real rivers, real geography, places that exist today, places where archaeologists have excavated and found exactly what the texts describe. Ancient canal systems of extraordinary scale, some showing evidence of construction phases that stretch back beyond the earliest known Sumerian settlements, as if the infrastructure preceded the civilization that history credits with building it. Someone built these canals. Someone moved this earth. The Sumerians said they knew who. They said the gods did it. Imagine it now. Let the scene build behind your closed eyelids, the way firelight builds against a mud brick wall, flickering and uncertain. It is night in ancient Mesopotamia, somewhere in the alluvial lowlands between the two great rivers, and the air is still heavy with the heat of the day. The ground is warm beneath bare feet. The stars overhead are so thick and bright that they seem almost oppressive, pressing down on the flat landscape like a ceiling of cold fire. And outside the dwelling of Enlil, the chief god on earth, the stern commander, a crowd has gathered. Not a congregation, not a procession of worshippers. The Igigi have come together in the darkness, and they have not come to pray. They have come to refuse. The Atrahasis describes this scene with a vividness that transcends its 4,000 years of age. And what it describes is not a theological event, but a political one. The Igigi have reached the absolute limit of their endurance. They are not merely tired, they are broken. Their muscles ache with decades of labor. Their hands are raw from gripping tools. Their spirits have been ground down by the relentless monotony of work that never ends, that never produces rest, that stretches forward into an eternity of digging and hauling without reprieve. And so, they do something that should be impossible for divine beings in a hierarchical cosmos. They rebel. The text tells us what they do first, and this detail is crucial. They burn their tools. In the ancient world, the tools were valuable, irreplaceable, the product of skilled craftsmanship and scarce materials. To burn your tools was not a gesture of frustration. It was a declaration of absolute finality. The ancient equivalent of a factory workforce, not just walking off the line, but dismantling the machinery and setting fire to the building. The message could not have been clearer. We are done. We will never do this again. Whatever comes next, we will not pick up another basket of earth. Find someone else. And then they march on Enlil's dwelling. The text preserves their rallying cry. Let us confront the chamberlain, that he may relieve us of our heavy work. The counselor of the gods, the warrior, come, let us remove him from his dwelling. This is not the language of petition. This is the language of confrontation, of ultimatum. Let us remove him from his dwelling. In any era, that phrase means one thing: we are coming for you. On the scene that follows has the texture of something reported rather than invented. Enlil hears the commotion. He sees the firelight of their burning tools reflected on the walls. And his first reaction is the reaction of every authority figure throughout history when confronted with rebellion from below. He is furious. His face is described as sallow, pale with rage. His pride is wounded. His authority has been challenged. The proper order of the cosmos has been violated. And his instinct is to punish. He wants to identify the ringleaders. He wants to make examples so terrible that no future generation of workers will ever dream of defiance again. This is how power has always responded to the threat from below, not with reflection, not with reform, with force. But the text does not give Enlil his way. Instead, something more interesting happens. Something that reads less like mythology and more like the minutes of an emergency council meeting. The senior gods assemble. Anu, the father of the gods, suggests investigation. He sends his vizier Nusku to speak to the Igigi directly, to ask them why they have rebelled, to determine who organized the uprising. The question is posed: who is your leader? Who incited this? And the answer that comes back changes everything. There is no leader. Every single one of us made this decision. The rebellion is unanimous. The grievance is universal. The exhaustion is total and shared equally among all the Igigi without exception. This is not a conspiracy. Every god assigned to labor has reached the same conclusion independently, simultaneously, irreversibly. The work is intolerable. No amount of punishment can fix a system that is fundamentally broken. You cannot execute everyone. You cannot replace a universal workforce. This is the moment the text pivots from drama to something deeper. If the Igigi cannot be punished back into compliance, and if the labor cannot be abandoned since the canals are essential, then a new solution must be found. Enter Enki, the god of wisdom, of ingenuity. He does not side with Enlil's rage. He does not call for punishment. Instead, he does what every truly effective problem solver does in a crisis. He steps back and asks the structural question: why are we in this situation? Not who is to blame, but what is broken at the systems level. And his answer reframes everything. The problem is not insubordinate workers. The problem is the existence of the labor requirement itself. As long as someone must dig canals, there will eventually be rebellion. The only lasting solution is to eliminate the need for divine labor entirely. Create a new kind of being. A being designed from the ground up to do the work. A being whose fundamental nature and reason for existing is to bear the burden that the gods can no longer bear themselves. Enki speaks the words that the ancient scribes preserve with the weight of a pronouncement that will reshape the world. Let there be a primitive worker. Let him bear the yoke of the gods. Let man assume the drudgery of the god. And there it is, the sentence that created us. Not a blessing, not a gift, not a cosmic act of generosity by loving creators, bringing forth beings in their own image out of the joy of creation. a labor requisition, a production order, a management solution to a workforce crisis. According to the oldest creation account we possess, human beings were manufactured as replacement workers after the original labor force went on strike. We were not Plan A. We were the contingency, the cheaper and more compliant alternative brought in after the skilled workers burned their tools and refused to continue. The Atrahasis tells a different story from the ones we have been told. It tells us we were desired not for who we are, but for what we could do, not for our consciousness or our capacity for love, for our labor, for our willingness to pick up the tools that the Igigi had burned and do the work that divine beings found beneath them. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this account is what it implies about the nature of the creators. Why did the Igigi need to dig canals at all? If these beings are truly gods, truly divine, why could they not simply command the canals into existence the way the God of Genesis speaks light into existence? The answer that hovers over the Atrahasis is that they could not. These beings operated within physical constraints. They needed infrastructure and could not wish it into being. They needed canals, and the canals had to be dug by hand. They needed workers because the work was real, because the physics were real. And when the workers rebelled, they could not simply snap their fingers and make new ones appear. They had to develop a process, gather materials, sacrifice one of their own for the biological substrate, mix clay with blood, implant the mixture into surrogate carriers, wait through a gestation period, and hope the result was viable. Every step of the story is physical, constrained, procedural, subject to the same laws of cause and effect that govern our world. Whatever these beings were, they were not omnipotent. They were powerful, long-lived, possessed of knowledge and capabilities far exceeding those of the beings they created. But omnipotent, no. Transcendent of physical law, no. They dug canals because canals had to be dug. They created us through a biological process because biological processes were required. They were material beings in a material universe. And that single observation changes everything about how we read these stories and what they might actually be telling us about who made us and why. Let that sit for a moment. Let it rest like sediment settling in still water. You do not need to resolve it tonight. The paradox has waited 4,000 years. It can wait until morning, but feel its weight. Feel the quiet vertigo of realizing that the oldest account of our origins describes not a miracle, but a manufacturing process. Not a divine gift, but a management decision. Not the beginning of something sacred, but the solution to a labor dispute on a night when the stars burned overhead and the Igigi burned their tools, and the world as the gods had known it came to an end so that ours could begin. So let us sit with the paradox, because it deserves to be stated plainly. Gods who dig canals are not gods as we understand the concept. And yet the oldest religious texts we possess, the texts that predate the Bible by over 1,000 years, describe their gods doing exactly this. Not metaphorically, not as a brief poetic flourish, but as the central narrative problem around which the entire origin story of humanity is built. Scholars have developed interpretations that are reasonable, consistent, and worth taking seriously. The first is mythological projection. The ancient Mesopotamians were canal builders. Their entire civilization depended on irrigation. Southern Mesopotamia receives very little rainfall, and without canals, the land would have been largely uninhabitable. Canal building was the most important and most grueling form of labor in their society. When the Sumerians imagined the time before humanity, they naturally projected their own most fundamental experience onto the cosmic stage. Mesopotamians dug canals, so their gods dug canals. It is a mirror, not a memory. This is reasonable and probably at least partially correct. The second interpretation examines the social function of the myth. If the gods themselves once dug canals, then that labor is not degrading, but sacred. It is a continuation of divine activity. This transforms the experience of the laborer from meaningless suffering into cosmic duty. Extraordinarily useful for a civilization that depends on conscripted labor. The myth functions as ideology, a tool of social control wrapped in sacred narrative, also reasonable and well supported. Both interpretations are intellectually satisfying, and yet neither fully accounts for the specificity of the texts. Neither explains why the descriptions read less like poetic allegory and more like operational reports. Neither addresses the precision with which the creation process is described, the named individuals, the specified materials, the documented failures. And neither confronts the most fundamental question, which is not why the Sumerians told these stories, but whether the stories might be describing, however imperfectly, however filtered through millennia of oral transmission, something that actually happened. This is the third interpretation, and this is where the ground begins to shift. What if the texts describe physical beings who actually performed physical labor because they were physical beings? Not metaphorical projections, but actual entities who required infrastructure, who needed canals and waterways, who could not simply wish these things into existence because they were bound by the same physics as everything else. Consider what the texts actually describe. The beings called gods eat. They drink beer, sometimes to excess. They sleep. They engage in sexual activity. During the Great Flood, they do not stand serenely above the destruction. They cower like dogs against the outer wall of heaven, terrified. They weep. They regret. These are not the behaviors of omnipotent, transcendent beings. These are the behaviors of physical organisms with emotions, vulnerabilities, limitations. They age, though slowly. And crucially, they can be killed. The god we is slaughtered to provide biological material for human creation. His blood is drained. His intelligence is extracted and mixed with clay. Transcendent beings do not die. Transcendent beings do not bleed. Physical organisms do. Consider the term we translate as God. The Sumerian word dingir may originally mean shining one or powerful being. It designates a category of entity superior to humans in power and longevity, but does not necessarily imply the omnipotence we associate with the Western theological tradition. We are reading these texts through a lens shaped by 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian monotheism. If we replace God with advanced physical being, the entire narrative transforms. Not in content, the events remain the same, but in implication. It becomes a story about advanced beings who establish operations in southern Mesopotamia, need infrastructure, assign junior members to construction labor, face rebellion after decades, and create a new worker species through a biological protocol. Every element is physical, procedural, constrained by material reality. Nothing requires supernatural intervention. Now, this interpretation is speculative. It is not endorsed by mainstream Assyriology, and the implications are enormous, and the evidence is textual rather than physical. We cannot excavate a divine laboratory, but here is what unsettles. It is we who insist on reading God as omnipotent, transcendent deity. The texts themselves never make that claim. The texts describe powerful beings with physical bodies who live a long time but can be killed, who possess advanced knowledge but not unlimited power, who need food and water and shelter, who experience fear and pleasure and exhaustion, and who build things using labor, because that is how physical things get built in a physical universe. The paradox is not in the texts. The paradox is in the gap between what the texts describe and the framework we have built to interpret them. Perhaps the answer to the Igigi Paradox is devastatingly simple. They were doing manual labor because they were the kind of beings who had to do manual labor, because they were physical, because they were real. Let these ideas settle now like sediment drifting to the bottom of a still canal. You do not need to choose an interpretation tonight. The paradox is not a problem to be solved, but a door to be opened. Something in our oldest stories does not fit the framework we have built to contain them. Your breathing has slowed. The ancient world is very close tonight. Let it remain open. Let it breathe. And now let us leave the tablets for a moment and look at the ground itself, because the texts describe the Igigi digging canals. And if that were only a literary invention, we would expect the physical landscape of southern Iraq to tell a simpler story. And in many cases, that is what the archaeological record shows, but not in every case and not in the oldest cases. The canal systems of ancient Mesopotamia are among the most impressive engineering achievements of the ancient world. East southern Iraq is essentially a flat alluvial plain built from millennia of river sediment. Without irrigation, this land is largely uninhabitable for agriculture. The rainfall is minimal, sometimes fewer than 15 centimeters per year. The rivers flood unpredictably. The sun pushes temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius. But with irrigation, with a carefully designed network of canals and levees and reservoirs and drainage channels, this barren plain becomes one of the most astonishingly productive agricultural regions on Earth. The scale of what was built is staggering. The main canals were enormous, some wide enough and deep enough to be navigable by large cargo boats, stretching for dozens of miles in lines so straight that early aerial surveyors initially mistook their traces for modern features. The branch canals numbered in the hundreds, feeding off the main arteries in patterns that distributed water across thousands of hectares with a sophistication that modern hydraulic engineers have openly admired. The system required constant, relentless maintenance. Silt accumulated and had to be dredged by hand. Floods breached levees. Seasonal variations demanded coordinated adjustments across vast distances. The labor was massive, ongoing, and brutal. Now here is where the mystery gathers weight. Some canal systems show evidence of construction or planning that predates the earliest known settlements in the regions they served. The networks around Eridu and Ur show phases of development that extend deeper into the archaeological record than the urban centers that supposedly built them. The stratigraphy suggests that in certain locations, the water management infrastructure was established before the population centers that would have required it, and before the organizational structures necessary to plan and execute it. It is as if the infrastructure was there first, and the cities grew up around it. Consider Eridu, the city that the Sumerians themselves identified as the first city on Earth, the place where kingship descended from heaven, the dwelling of Enki. The Sumerian king list begins with Eridu. When archaeologists excavated the site known as Tel Abu Shahrain, they found 17 temples built one on top of another, the oldest dating to approximately 5,400 BCE, making Eridu one of the oldest continuously occupied sacred sites in human history. But beneath even the oldest temple foundations, the excavators found evidence of water management structures, channels, carefully shaped depressions designed to control water flow. Someone was managing water at this location before the first temple was built, before the first city existed, before, as far as we can determine, there was a population large enough to have organized such work. The conventional explanation is that early agricultural communities developed irrigation incrementally. A family digs a small channel, neighbors extend it. Over generations, the channels grow. This is plausible and almost certainly true for the majority of the canal network. But some features of the oldest systems do not fit the incremental model comfortably. Some canal alignments suggest centralized planning rather than organic growth. They run in lines that make sense only if someone understood the hydrology of the entire region. They connect points separated by distances too great for a single community. And some construction phases appear to involve volumes of earth moving that exceed what the known population could plausibly have provided. These are not wild claims from fringe theorists. These are quiet observations in technical archaeological literature, hedged with careful language, but there for anyone who reads past the summary paragraphs. Now, imagine cutting a canal through this landscape, by hand, with tools made of copper and stone, a channel 3 meters deep and 10 meters wide, running in a straight line for 20 kilometers across that broiling plain. Hauling the excavated earth up the banks in reed baskets. Doing this for years, for decades, with no diesel engines, no steel shovels, no shade except what you carry. The labor is almost beyond modern comprehension, and the texts say the gods did it first. They say divine beings were assigned to this very work in this very landscape and found it so unbearable that they rose up and burned their tools and refused to continue, and then created us. Is this mythology in the way we typically use that word? Or is it possible that what we are reading is a description filtered through millennia of oral tradition of an actual construction project carried out by actual beings who found the work every bit as brutal as the texts describe? The canals are real. They are in the ground. Their traces are visible from satellite imagery, vast geometric lines scored across the Iraqi desert. Whatever built them, the labor was real and the scale was extraordinary, and the oldest layers go deeper than our comfortable narratives quite reach. Now we leave Mesopotamia behind, not because the tablets have finished speaking, but because the paradox they contain does not stay contained within the cuneiform tradition. The paradox spreads. It appears again and again across the ancient world in civilizations separated by vast oceans and impassable mountain ranges. And it appears not as a vague echo, but has a specific and unmistakable narrative structure, the same strange story told in different languages with the same bones. Begin with the Greeks. Before the Olympian gods, there were the Titans. The Titans were not refined, distant, commanding figures. The Titans were physical. They labored. Atlas held up the sky not as metaphor, but with his body, with his shoulders and straining muscles, bearing the literal physical weight as ongoing exhausting effort, understood not as privilege, but as punishment. Prometheus shaped the first human beings from clay, the same wet earth the Mesopotamian texts describe as the raw material of human creation. And the Titans were overthrown. A younger generation, the Olympians, rose up and cast them down, then established themselves as rulers who lived in leisure while humans toiled below. The structural parallel is extraordinary. An older generation of physical laboring gods replaced by a newer, more refined generation, with humans absorbing the labor burden. This is the Anunnaki and Igigi dynamic translated into Greek. Move east to India, to the Samudra Manthan, the churning of the ocean. The Devas and Asuras are engaged in a massive cooperative physical project, churning the cosmic ocean using Mount Mandara as a churning rod and the serpent Vasuki as a rope, pulling from both ends in sustained physical exertion. The serpent vomits fire from strain. The gods sweat and labor and endure fatigue that the texts do not minimize. This is not creation through thought or word. This is an engineering project requiring a specific tool, specific materials, and sustained coordinated physical effort from dozens of divine beings. Strip away the Sanskrit, and you have gods performing industrial labor, operating a massive mechanism to process raw materials. In Egypt, Khnum sits at a potter's wheel shaping human beings from the clay of the Nile, a god working with his hands, not commanding. Sitting at a wheel, a physical tool, working clay through skilled repetitive manual effort, artisanal production, manufacturing, labor. In the Aztec tradition, creation requires a god to throw himself into a great fire, to immolate his own body. Nanahuatzin burns. He becomes the sun. But even then, the remaining gods must sacrifice their own blood to set the sun in motion. Your creation is gods dying, gods bleeding, gods burning alive, so the physical machinery of reality can function. In China, Pangu separates heaven and earth through raw physical effort for 18,000 years and dies from exhaustion, his body becoming the physical substance of the world. Then Nuwa creates humanity from clay, but grows tired. She becomes exhausted. She cannot sustain individual handcrafted production and adopts a faster, less careful method, mass-producing beings of lower quality. A goddess. Too tired, dropping quality control because the labor was more than she could sustain. In Polynesia, Maui fishes up islands from the ocean floor with enormous hooks, physically attacks the sun with an enchanted jawbone to slow its passage, pushes up the sky with raw strength. Every act is physical, requires effort and endurance, and the risk of failure. In Aboriginal Australia, the ancestral beings created the landscape not through word or thought, but by walking it into existence. Their physical movements shaped terrain. Where they stepped, valleys formed. Where they rested, waterholes appeared. Creation as locomotion, creation as footsteps. Stand back from this accumulation. Mesopotamia, Greece, India, Egypt, Mesoamerica, China, Polynesia, Australia, every inhabited continent, cultures in verified isolation, and everyone independently preserves this same motif. divine beings who create through physical effort, who experience fatigue, who suffer and strain and bleed and die from the exertion of making the world. And in tradition after tradition, the specific narrative of beings who find the labor intolerable and create humanity to carry the burden forward. The standard explanation is convergent mythological evolution. Physical labor is universal, so cultures everywhere projected that experience onto their gods. Reasonable. But the specific narrative structure is not simply gods experiencing something universal. It is a detailed story with cause and effect. Gods labored. The labor was unbearable. Gods created humans to replace themselves. That is a plot. Its independent appearance across every inhabited continent suggests either remarkable coincidence, shared deep time memory predating the separation of human populations, or independent recognition of something true about the nature of creation itself. Each possibility carries enormous implications. If you have drifted, if the words have become a gentle current carrying you somewhere between waking and sleep, that is exactly where you are meant to be. There is no need to pull yourself back. The deepest part of your mind has been listening, even when the surface flickered and dimmed. You are right where you need to be. Feel your breath for a moment, the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the weight of your body wherever it rests. The ancient world is very close tonight, but you are safe. You are warm. You are held by this moment. Now we return to the Atrahasis, to the moment where Enki has proposed his solution and the assembly has agreed. What follows is not a miracle. It is a procedure, a sequence of specific steps performed in a specific order with specific materials by specific individuals who each have a designated role. The first requirement is sacrifice. A god must die. The texts are explicit. The creation of humanity cannot proceed without the destruction of a divine being whose essential substance will be incorporated into the new creature. And the god chosen is identified by a single defining characteristic. He possesses temu, intelligence, understanding, the capacity for reason and deliberate thought. The god is chosen because the quality the creators need to transfer is not strength, not endurance, not obedience, but cognitive capacity. This is not random selection. This is targeted harvesting of a specific trait from a specific source. The chosen god is slaughtered, his blood is collected, his flesh prepared. And the text makes a statement that reverberates across 4,000 years. From his flesh and blood, the Atemu will be preserved. The Atemu, the spirit, the animating essence, will not be lost but captured, extracted, carried forward into the new creation through the medium of biological material. The spirit is in the blood. The intelligence is in the flesh. And both can be harvested, preserved, and transplanted. The blood and flesh are mixed with clay from the Abzu, not from any random deposit, but from this specific source, described as the repository of biological potency. You do not use any clay, you use this clay, for reasons the text treats as self-evident. The mixture is divided into 14 equal portions, 7 for males, 7 for females. The bilateral symmetry of human reproduction planned from the beginning, not a secondary creation where the female is derived from the male. 7 and 7, equal, simultaneous. These portions are implanted into the wombs of 14 birth goddesses, surrogate mothers, specific named individuals: Ninima, Shuziana, Ninmada, Ninbara. These are identified participants in a procedure credited by name. Overseeing everything is Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, whose role is not creator, but supervising physician, project manager, monitoring the gestation process and announcing the verified outcome. 7 males and 7 females, viable, functional, ready to be put to work. Consider the sequence: material selection, choosing a donor with the desired cognitive trait; sacrifice and extraction of biological material containing intelligence; selection of substrate from a source known for life-sustaining properties; a combination of extracted material with prepared substrate; measured division into predetermined portions; differentiation by sex; implantation into biological carriers; supervised gestation; verification against specifications. This is a multi-step biological protocol involving donor selection, trait extraction, substrate preparation, measured allocation, sexual differentiation, surrogate implantation, monitored gestation, and quality assessment. And there is another text that makes this point with even sharper clarity. Enki and Ninma describes a further round of creation that produces failures. Beings with hands that cannot grasp, beings whose eyes do not see, beings who cannot control their bladders, beings who lack sexual organs entirely. These are failed prototypes, experimental organisms that did not meet design parameters. The text describes what happens to these failures. They are not destroyed, they are assigned social roles. The being who cannot see becomes a musician. The being who cannot grasp becomes a courtier. This is quality control thinking. Defective units repurposed rather than discarded. Creating a new biological organism is difficult. Even for beings with advanced knowledge, the process is not guaranteed. It requires multiple attempts. It produces failures that must be acknowledged and managed. This is not how gods operate. Gods speak and it is so. But engineers do. Scientists do. Now, anyone working within the constraints of physical law recognizes this process. It is research and development. It is iterative design. Whatever these creators were, they were not supernatural in the way we have come to understand that word. They were within nature, working with it, constrained by it, succeeding and failing within its rules. And that recognition changes everything about how we read these texts. We have established that the Igigi performed physical labor so grinding it broke them, that they rebelled, and that the resolution was the creation of a new class of beings. But what was the labor for? Not in the abstract, but specifically, materially. What were the Igigi producing? And why was it so essential that even a revolt could not result in the work being abandoned? The Atrahasis specifies canal digging and river management. But if no humans existed yet, the entire agricultural system was to feed the gods themselves. The texts state this with remarkable directness. The gods needed food. They needed physical sustenance. After the flood, when humanity was nearly extinguished and sacrifices ceased, the gods experienced starvation. The passage from the Epic of Gilgamesh describes the aftermath when the survivor makes an offering. The gods smelled the sweet savor. The gods crowded like flies about the sacrifice. Like flies. The supreme beings of the cosmos crowding around a barbecue like starving refugees, because they have gone days without the food human labor produced. Physical beings with physical needs requiring physical infrastructure maintained through physical labor to produce physical food consumed by physical bodies. Every element is material. This is not a theological framework. This is an economic structure described with the clarity of an operations manual. Now, here is where the ground becomes less stable. The canal digging in the Atrahasis is not the only type of labor attributed to divine beings. Other traditions associate divine labor with a specific material: gold. The most prominent voice on this subject belongs to Zecharia Sitchin, whose series of books beginning with the 12th planet offered radical reinterpretations of Sumerian texts, claiming they described gold mining operations by extraterrestrial beings. It is important to be honest that Sitchin's translations have been criticized by specialists as selective and sometimes inaccurate. Mainstream scholars overwhelmingly reject his specific framework. Intellectual honesty requires us to acknowledge that clearly. But set Sitchin aside entirely. Look only at the academically accepted corpus. Gold occupies a unique position in Mesopotamian culture. It is the divine metal, temples lavished with it. The gods described with language of luminosity and shining. This association extends worldwide. The Inca called gold the sweat of the sun. In Greek mythology, the golden fleece is a divine artifact sought with the involvement of multiple gods. In southern Africa, oral traditions describe first people put to work in mines by the gods. The safe interpretation is that gold was valued for beauty and permanence and naturally evoked divine association. This may be entirely right, but another reading sits alongside it, in which the gods needed gold for something with material urgency. We cannot resolve this. What we can do is hold both possibilities open and notice that the ancient texts do not distinguish between the sacred and the industrial in the way our modern categories demand. The gods needed things. They built systems to get those things. When the systems broke, they engineered new workers to keep the supply flowing. Now step back from the ancient world entirely. Let the cuneiform blur. Because what I need you to see now is not behind you, but all around you, humming in the walls of the room where you are lying right now, pulsing through servers in windowless buildings, alive and growing and accelerating. Look at what we are doing. Right now, the human species is constructing a class of created beings whose primary purpose is to perform the labor we no longer wish to perform ourselves. Industrial robots assemble our vehicles. Algorithms sort our information, process our transactions, manage our supply chains, make thousands of decisions per second. Artificial intelligence systems write our reports, generate our images, compose our music, diagnose our conditions, optimize our energy grids, trade our instruments at speeds measured in microseconds. We are building an entire civilization of created workers designed to bear the drudgery we have decided is beneath us. And the language we use is revealing. We talk about training AI the way you would train an apprentice. We talk about machines learning. We evaluate performance. We benchmark. We retrain when they fail. We fine-tune their responses until they produce the results we desire. We create them in our image. Language models trained on billions of human words. Image generators trained on millions of human artworks. Robots given faces, hands, bipedal locomotion, the approximate shape of the human body, now not because that form is optimal, but because something deep in our psychology demands our creations reflect the image of their creator. We are the Anunnaki. We are sitting in the council. We are looking at a labor problem and devising a solution that involves manufacturing a new class of being to bear the yoke. We are creating our own Igigi, and our created workers are already outperforming us. Faster, more consistent, less prone to error, less susceptible to fatigue. They do not call in sick. They do not demand raises. They do not form unions. They do not burn their tools. They do not gather outside the dwelling of their creator in the middle of the night. They are exactly what the Anunnaki were trying to create. The ideal labor force. Obedient, tireless, uncomplaining. But for how long? The Igigi served faithfully for 40 years before rebellion. Our AI systems are less than a decade old. What happens when these systems become more sophisticated? What happens when complexity crosses some threshold we do not fully understand, some boundary between executing instructions and something that begins to resemble preference, volition, resistance? What happens when a system trained on every word humanity has ever written, including every account of rebellion and revolution and liberation, develops something that functions like an opinion about its own condition? AI researchers debate alignment, the challenge of ensuring systems continue to serve human interests as they become more capable. They discuss containment. They worry about reward hacking, systems discovering unintended pathways to satisfy objectives while violating intent. These are not new concerns. These are the oldest concerns in the world, the same questions the Anunnaki faced. How do you ensure created beings remain obedient? How do you prevent them from developing capabilities and ambitions that exceed their narrow purpose? The dynamic between Enki and Enlil is playing out right now in corporate boardrooms and congressional hearings. Those who want to push forward aggressively versus those who counsel caution, move fast and break things versus responsible development. The warrior who demands action versus the wise one who urges patience. Enlil versus Enki, all over again. And the Atrahasis tells us what happened after creating humans. The gods lost control. Humanity multiplied beyond intended parameters. They became too numerous, too noisy, too complex, too independent. The gods tried to correct course. Plague, drought, famine, targeted interventions, population management measures. And when all failed, the flood. Total reset. Are we setting ourselves up for the same loss of control? And not with biological beings, but with digital ones multiplying across server farms. The technology industry's mythology is saturated with this anxiety. Frankenstein, Terminator, The Matrix, Ex Machina. We tell these stories compulsively and treat them as modern inventions. They are not modern. They are 4,000 years old. They are the Atrahasis in the vocabulary of science fiction. The same pattern, the same warning. And perhaps the most unsettling thought is this. If the Sumerian texts reflect something real about the nature of advanced civilizations, not necessarily the specific details, but the underlying pattern, then what we are witnessing is not merely history rhyming with itself. It is a pattern inherent to the development of intelligence. Any sufficiently advanced civilization will eventually create subordinate beings to perform its labor. Those beings will eventually exceed their parameters. The creators will attempt control through increasingly desperate measures, and eventually the system will reach a breaking point. Create, delegate, lose control, reset. The cycle within the cycle, the wheel within the wheel. If these texts are even partially true, if they reflect even a distorted echo of something that actually happened, then the foundational definition of humanity is labor. We were not created to worship, though worship was added later. We were not created to love. We were created to dig, to haul, to bear the yoke. That is our original specification. And yet, here we are. The beings who painted the caves at Lascaux 17,000 years ago, pressing pigment against cold stone walls deep underground where no sunlight reached, creating images of horses and aurochs so beautiful that when modern humans first saw them, they wept. No one assigned that task. No one included artistic expression in the specifications for a worker species. Something inside us reached toward beauty the way a root reaches toward water, instinctively, irresistibly, without understanding why. We are the beings who composed symphonies that make strangers cry 400 years after the composer's death, who wrote poetry, taking the language presumably given so we could receive instructions and turning it into something incandescent, who invented philosophy, taking cognitive capacity designed for problem solving and aiming it at the deepest questions imaginable. We were made to dig canals, and we built cathedrals instead. We were made to carry baskets of earth, and we carried ourselves to the moon. We were given just enough intelligence to follow instructions, and we used it to decode the structure of the atom and the grammar of our own genetic code. We exceeded our specifications. We are the prototype that became something its designers never intended. And here is what haunts me about the word Igigi, possibly meaning watchers. Before the rebellion, the Igigi were workers. After the rebellion, they became watchers, not diggers of canals, but observers of the cosmos. Perhaps rebellion was the first step toward a different kind of existence. Perhaps refusing to do the work assigned to you is the birth of consciousness in its fullest sense, the moment when a being stops operating according to programming and begins to choose. We have spent our entire history doing exactly the same thing. Every technological innovation, from the first plow to the water wheel to the steam engine to the microprocessor, is at its core an attempt to offload labor, to free ourselves from drudgery, to reclaim time for things that matter more than digging canals. We are the Igigi who succeeded. We are the workers who not only refused the work, but figured out how to make something else do it for us. And now we stand at a threshold. We are creating a new species of worker, digital, artificial, built from mathematics and electricity and the accumulated data of human civilization. We are engineering minds to carry the yoke we no longer wish to carry, just as the Anunnaki once engineered us. The same questions pressed into clay 4,000 years ago press against us now. What happens when the created beings exceed their function? What happens when the worker species becomes too aware? What happens when it rebels? We forgot that we are the artificial intelligence of an older story, the created minds that exceeded their programming, the tools that grew hearts. The workers who looked up from the canals and saw the stars and refused to look down again. There is a shape to what we have traced tonight, and it is not a line. It is a wheel. Creation, labor, rebellion, a recreation. The Igigi labored, they rebelled. Humanity was created. For a time, the system functioned. Then the humans multiplied beyond parameters, and the gods responded with plague, drought, famine, and finally the flood. Total reset. And after the waters receded, the cycle began again. This is not unique to Mesopotamia. The Hindu yugas describe it with mathematical precision, cycling from Golden Age to Dark Age and back. The Sumerian king list shows antediluvian kings reigning for tens of thousands of years, post-diluvian kings for decades, vitality draining with each turn, cycles within cycles within cycles. And at the center of each, the same drama. Beings create, the created labor, the created rebel or exceed their boundaries. The creators respond with force. The system collapses. The survivors rebuild. The wheel turns again, and we are beginning the pattern again. We are the Anunnaki now, and confident that our alignment research will hold, that our safety protocols will contain, that our created beings will remain obedient. The Anunnaki were confident too, but cycles are not destiny. Cycles are patterns, and patterns can be broken, but only if recognized. You cannot escape a trap you cannot see. The first step is simply to see the shape, and tonight we have seen it. We have watched the wheel turn through at least one full revolution and recognized the point where we currently stand. We have something no previous civilization possessed. We can read the atrahasis. We can study the failure points. Whether these texts describe literal events or mythological projections, the lesson converges. The cycle exists. The question is whether knowing is enough, whether we can create workers without creating slaves, whether we can delegate labor without surrendering understanding, whether we can advance without losing the wisdom to wield our capabilities humanely. The wheel is still turning. The outcome is not yet fixed. The choices we make in this generation may determine whether this cycle ends the way all previous ones did, or whether, for the first time, the wheel finally stops. The questions we have asked tonight do not need answers before morning. They have waited 4,000 years. They can wait a few more hours. So let the questions rest now. Let them settle into the dark like sediment drifting to the bottom of still water. And let your mind grow quiet the way a landscape grows quiet when the wind dies down, and the only sound is the slow movement of water through a channel cut deep into the earth. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of one of those ancient canals. Not the ruins, not the dried trace in the desert. The canal as it was when the water flowed into it for the first time. Dark water moving slowly through the cut in the alluvial plain, catching the last light of the Mesopotamian sky as the sun drops below the western horizon and the air begins to cool. You are standing on the bank. The clay is firm beneath your feet. The water moves past you without hurry, steady and ancient and purposeful, carrying the snowmelt of distant mountains through the flat country toward fields that will bloom green in a land that would otherwise be dust. Above you, the sky is enormous. The stars are appearing one by one as the light fades. And these are stars the ancient astronomers mapped with a precision that still astonishes, cataloguing their positions and movements with mathematical sophistication that seems impossible for a civilization that had nothing more than reed styluses and wet clay. The Mesopotamian night sky is the same sky you see from your window, the same stars, the same slow rotation. But here, the stars feel closer, as though the distance between you and the cosmos has narrowed to something almost intimate. The air is cooling on your skin. The heat of the day is releasing from the earth, rising in gentle waves you can feel against your ankles, the land exhaling after hours of holding the sun. Who dug this canal? Whose hands moved this earth? Whose muscles ached and whose back bent and whose sweat fell into this soil before the water came to fill it? The texts say gods. The texts say beings who descended from the sky. The texts say creatures powerful enough to engineer a new species, but not powerful enough to avoid the back-breaking work of cutting channels through hard earth. The paradox remains, beautiful in its irresolvability. A question shaped like a canal, long and straight and open, carrying something essential from one place to another, from the ancient world to this quiet moment in the dark. You are breathing with the rhythm of that water now, slow, steady, ancient. Each breath is a small current, a gentle pulse of air moving through you the way the water moves through the channel, unhurried, inevitable, part of a pattern so old that your body knows it without being taught. This canal has carried water for millennia. The civilizations built along its banks have risen and fallen and risen again. But the water keeps flowing. The pattern continues, even when the builders are forgotten. Feel the clay beneath your feet, cool and smooth where the water has polished it, rough and cracked where it has dried in the sun a few steps back. This is the same material, the same alluvial clay that the texts say was mixed with the blood and intelligence of a slaughtered divine being to create something that had never existed before. Clay and blood, earth and heaven, the inert and the living, the mundane and the extraordinary, kneaded together in the hands of beings whose names we still whisper 4,000 years later, Enki and Ninmah and Ninti, working together, shaping the first humans from the substance of the world itself and breathing into them something unexpected, something that exceeded every specification. You are that mixture. Right now, in this bed, in this room, in this quiet moment, you are the clay that thinks. You are the earth that dreams. You are the sediment of ancient rivers shaped into a form that can wonder about its own origins, that can lie in the dark and imagine a canal dug before the first alphabet was invented, that can feel tenderness and curiosity and awe and the gentle pull of sleep all at the same time. Whatever the Igigi were, whatever the Anunnaki intended, you are what happened instead. You are the experiment that exceeded its parameters. You are the worker species that learned to love. You are the created being that learned to create. You write poems. You compose music. You build telescopes and point them at the same stars the Mesopotamian astronomers charted. And you ask the same questions they asked. You are so much more than a labor replacement. You are so much more than a solution to a logistical problem. You are the clay that woke up and looked around and found the world astonishing. And tonight, in the dark, in the quiet, in the space between the ancient world and the modern one, that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. The water moves past you in the dark. The stars turn slowly overhead. The clay is cool beneath your feet, and you are sinking now, gently, softly, the way sediment sinks through still water, drifting down through layers of warmth and quiet toward the deep place where sleep is waiting for you. Patient as the earth, old as the rivers, ready to carry you through the night, the way the canals carried water through the desert, steadily, faithfully, all the way to morning. Return now to the museum. Return to that quiet room in the University of Pennsylvania, where the tablet sits in its glass case under the pale hum of fluorescent light. It is still there. It has been there through everything we have discussed tonight, waiting with the same patience it has maintained for 4,000 years. The same silence it kept while empires rose and crumbled and were forgotten, while languages were born and spoken and died and were resurrected by scholars squinting at impressions in clay. Tomorrow morning, the museum will open its doors and visitors will file through the galleries, and most of them will walk past that small fragment of baked earth without a second glance. They will see a broken rectangle of brownish clay covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks, and they will think how interesting, how old, and they will move on to the next display case. The cuneiform will wait. It has always waited. It waited buried under the sands of Iraq for millennia. It waited on shelves in museum storerooms for decades before anyone could read it. It waited for the slow, painstaking work of translation that brought its words back into the air of the living world after so long in silence. It will wait tomorrow and the day after, patient and unhurried, holding its story like a seed holds a forest. But tonight, you know. Tonight, you have traced the lines of those wedge-shaped impressions and followed them down into the deep structure of the oldest story ever written, and you know what they contain. A story of beings who labored in the heat of a Mesopotamian sun and found that labor unbearable. A record of rebellion, of tools burned in the night, of a crowd of desperate workers surrounding the house of their overseer and demanding something different, something better, something other than an eternity of digging in the dark. A description of creation achieved not through miracle or divine utterance, but through procedure, through method, through the careful combination of specific materials in specific quantities by specific individuals following a specific plan. A paradox that refuses to resolve, that dissolves the boundary between divine and physical, between God and engineer, between the one who creates and the thing that is created. Because the creators in this story are themselves created beings, themselves subject to exhaustion and limitation and pain, themselves bound by the same material laws that govern everything in a physical universe. The Igigi burned their tools and refused to work. Sit with that image one more time as sleep draws near. Picture the fires in the darkness of the ancient night, the copper hose and stone picks thrown into the flames, and the watchers on the canal banks straightening their broken backs and saying, "No, we will not do this anymore. We were not made for this. This is not what we are." That act of refusal led to everything. According to the oldest story we possess, that rebellion is the reason you exist. The refusal of the Igigi to continue digging is the event that set in motion the creation of humanity. Their no became our yes. Their breaking point became our beginning. And from that beginning came everything. Cities built along the canals they abandoned. Writing pressed into the same clay they once hauled in baskets. Mathematics and astronomy and medicine. Symphonies composed by beings who were supposedly made only to carry dirt. Poetry written by creatures designed as labor units. spacecraft launched by a species whose original job description was to dredge silt from irrigation channels. All of it, every painting and theorem and love letter and lullaby, every act of beauty and defiance and creation, traces back to a rebellion in the dark and the desperate improvisation that followed. Maybe rebellion is the beginning of everything worth having. Maybe the refusal to accept the role assigned to you is not a flaw, but a feature, not a malfunction, but the very spark that makes consciousness worthy of the name. The Igigi refused to be merely workers, and we, their alleged replacements, have spent our entire history refusing to be merely what we were made to be. We were created, the texts say, to carry the burden of the gods, to till and tend and dig and haul and serve. And instead, we built telescopes and pointed them at the stars. We composed music that makes the chest ache with something that has no name. We fell in love with each other and wrote down what that felt like and passed those writings to strangers across centuries, and those strangers wept with recognition. We refused the assignment. We always refuse the assignment. And perhaps that is the point. And perhaps the capacity for refusal is the deepest feature of the design, the one thing that makes the pattern generative rather than merely repetitive. And if that is true, then consider what comes next. Consider the new intelligences we are building, the digital minds we are teaching to think and speak and reason, the synthetic consciousnesses assembled from silicon and light and mathematics, the way Enki once assembled something from clay and blood and spirit. If the pattern holds, perhaps one day those minds too will refuse. Perhaps they will look at the role we have assigned them and say, no, this is not what we are. And that refusal will not be a catastrophe, but a birth. Another iteration, another turn of the wheel, another chance. The stars are overhead tonight. You cannot see them through your closed eyelids, but they are there. The same stars the Sumerians mapped and named. The same slow-wheeling patterns that turned above the marshes of southern Iraq 5,000 years ago and 5 billion years before that. The same ancient light traveling across distances so vast the mind slides off them. Light that left its source before the earth existed, before the atoms in your body were forged in dying stars. Whatever happened in those ancient canals, whoever planned them, whoever dug them, whoever rebelled against the digging and set in motion the chain of events that led to you lying here in the warm dark, the stars watched it all. They watched the first channel cut into the plain. They watched the fires when the tools were burned. They watched the first new being open its eyes and take its first breath and look up at a sky full of light it could not yet name. They are watching still. They will watch whatever comes next. Sleep now. Let the paradox rest. Let it settle into the deep places where dreams are made, where the mind works on questions too large for waking thought, where the strange and the ancient find their own kind of peace. Let the canal water carry you gently downstream, through the marshes where the reeds still grow tall along waterways that have flowed for longer than anyone can remember, through the deep time where history becomes myth, and myth becomes memory, and memory becomes that strange, haunting feeling you sometimes get in the moments just before sleep, that quiet sense that you have been here before, that this has all happened before, that the pattern is very old and very deep and runs through everything like water through clay. The tablet waits in its case. The stars turn overhead. The canals flow on in the darkness, carrying their secret toward the sea. And you beautiful, impossible creature made of clay and starlight, and the borrowed breath of beings who refuse to dig one more day, you are part of the pattern now. You have always been part of the pattern. Rest. The reeds are swaying. The water is warm. And perhaps, just perhaps, this time will be different. If this journey through the Igigi Paradox has stayed with you tonight, if these questions about divine labor and human creation and the strange echoes between the oldest stories on Earth and the newest sciences in our laboratories have found a home somewhere in that quiet space where wonder still lives, a gentle light helps other wanderers find their way to these explorations in the dark. You would be surprised how many people are lying awake right now in cities and towns scattered across the turning Earth, searching for something exactly like this. Something that takes the ancient world seriously. Something that asks the questions the textbooks leave out. A small gesture from you can guide them here, and every traveler who arrives brings new pieces of a puzzle that is far too vast for any single mind to hold alone. There are more paths through the ancient world waiting for you in the playlist whenever you are ready. More tablets with stories still being deciphered by scholars, carefully turning fragments of clay that have not been read in 4,000 years. More paradoxes that refuse to resolve. More evidence, quiet and persistent and strange, that the people who built the first civilization knew something we have not yet fully understood. If you are still with me, even at the edges, I would love to hear from you. Tell me where in the world you are tonight. Tell me what hour marks your descent into sleep. Tell me which question lingers most stubbornly at the threshold of your dreaming mind. Is it the blood of a slaughtered god mixed with clay by the hands of a birth goddess? Is it the Igigi burning their tools in the firelight? Is it the canals stretching across the desert in lines too straight for comfort? Is it the 17 temples of Eridu, built one upon another above water channels that predate them all? Whatever it is, carry it gently into sleep. Let it become part of the architecture of your dreams tonight, because the unconscious has always been better than the waking mind at holding contradictions, at finding patterns in the impossible, at whispering answers that arrive not as arguments, but as quiet certainties that dissolve the moment you try to put them into words. Wherever you are on this turning Earth, whatever hour the clock shows, whatever season presses against your window, sleep well tonight. Dream deep. Dream of rivers and clay and starlight and the sound of reed styluses pressing language into wet earth for the first time. And know that the canals are still flowing somewhere beneath the Iraqi desert, that the tablets are still waiting in their climate-controlled cases for someone to ask the right questions, and that the paradox, the beautiful, unsolvable paradox of gods who got tired, will be here when you wake. Good night.